Is this like PDF? Oh, I think he has it in his desk. Hey, when you go for the shoe, bring your bottle also.
Okay, I'll just go where should we?
And bottle. How's Vaibhav doing? How's his family going? Now that you graduated, you have some students.
Yeah, you told me.
No, either.
Sorry.
Uma, this is Anna, who is I play badminton with on weekends. I think even Neil is coming. Maybe
Okay.
he's taking a seat.
I hide myself because I'm too early.
It's too early. It's very awkward right now.
No, it's just 20 minutes now. It's okay.
Okay.
Sounds like cool, right?
For French people, it's okay.
That is way too early for me. All right, I'll come back.
That is from YouTube.
So, I can trace it. It's not It's really helpful.
But he's going to national level.
Then I can buy it also.
Thing is, like, he's going to national level means
It's like something for 1 year or something, not 2 years.
post of college.
It's
Post of.
I guess it gives more time to such work.
Sanket was there. He was doing it before. I don't know, like, we just did it.
Because he went there.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, that was the only difference between other people and me. Like,
You would think that it would last till
ah,
because
it's
they're
okay.
already
Yeah,
done.
I also thought that. Yeah, but that was the only difference between other people.
I don't know what to do for almost taking 4 years. Like after that, we take sometimes they know
Oh, really? Okay. Okay. the state is
Yeah.
moving. Makes it very irritating. Also, he's doing this, it's just. So he can only write it. Every ethics, real time decision making. But water resources ka
Do you guys know that both of you share something common? And Anna, do you guys talk about your research?
Sorry?
Do you guys talk about your research?
No.
She's doing a PhD in immunology.
Yeah. It's far from me, but yeah.
But
I
she's also
stopped immunology. I hated that. Yeah.
she's now training.
Now, on my camp.
Oh, very
I'm doing my postdoc at Harvard School. So I'm working on immunology.
And Uma, what do you do?
We work on stroke.
So yeah.
And use them also. So I'm studying the immune cell aspects. Okay.
Where do you study?
Dallas.
Oh.
It's like Western Medical.
Yeah.
No,
Yes, it's far from here.
that's where sometimes when
How long is it to go?
3 hours.
4 hours. You'll figure it out when you go back tomorrow. It takes half an hour. It's 3.5.
Mm-hmm.
It takes half an hour.
Oh, I think one flight is 3 hours and the other flight is
4 hours.
And how long are you almost done?
Hopefully.
Sorry for the question.
6 to 8 months left.
Oh, yeah. It's the best part. You know that.
Are you came this weekend?
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, that's the when I was 6. It was just so from the parents and there's now something in this weekend.
Oh, he's coming.
Should be, yeah. It was not sick.
Live stream. People are going to see what's happening. My parents are. There's a YouTube live stream.
Yes.
A YouTube live stream.
Oh, wow.
So people are. My parents are essentially watching.
Okay. They were not supposed to come.
It's too expensive. And they had they're going for another. I think, so.
Mm-hmm. They were watching.
It's currently on, so yeah, they can hear me.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's serious. So how is it working here? The difference you have a jury?
Yeah. So this is the public defense. Now the public defense will be a close. Another half an hour close meeting with the jury.
Okay. It's the same day?
Yeah, it's going to happen immediately after this. So
Okay.
before this entire defense, I had a really long meeting with the short minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when it's it.
Okay.
And I've had a defense and then after this,
Okay.
they
So
tell me about my what I need. I also submitted my thesis to them, rough draft series.
Yeah.
They're going to give their comments in the thesis presentation.
what?
Oh.
Oh. That These are my main ones. Yeah.
Or the fail, nobody would come.
We'll just
Please, you got day off on your work?
no.
No, she's working.
I am working. I am going back.
Or you just do
I'm just taking 2 hours. I'm an intern. Come on, it's fine.
English weekend?
Yes. Are you? Are you?
Right? They only a few hours in Sunday. My brother,
Ooh, oh, that's cool. Are you training tomorrow? All right.
Oh, come on, the day after.
tomorrow is also one of my colleagues' defense here in this room.
Ah. Stand in front of your presentation.
We can see each other's. You can take photographs. Cool. Yeah, mine is also if you're coming to
Oh, but I don't want to be like the one coming in at 2 and then you're like starting and then I'm like, shoot. And then
Just
I'm
supposed
like,
to start at 2.
Yeah.
Folks were right early, so no one disturbed you, especially during the.
But that's
First
why
10
they
minutes
close
of your
that
time?
door and you keep the door open.
That's true. That's true.
I think we had specific. You told me
Yeah, I
maybe
was-
3 or 4 times that I was too early.
Oh, really? How early were you?
20 minutes.
Oh, wow. Actually, I could have, I know, I wouldn't have to. I got across the river at like 1:30 and I was like, oh shoot, I came too early. And then I just went to the bathroom in like the dome building first. And then I slowly walked here.
They don't know how it goes in semester.
Is it a blue bus?
But during the afternoon, they are not so often. Yeah. And even during the morning, it's not every 20 minutes, so if you miss class, that's good.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, it started raining.
Oh yeah.
Just,
Is it?
It's weird rain though, because it's not hard enough for an umbrella. But then you still get wet if you walk. Are you excited?
I think so. Wait, let me just check if everything's good.
and then it's vacations once you're done.
Also vacation and submit my papers.
Oh, yeah. That's what you do.
And I have a bunch of like interviews and tests for jobs. So
That was my defense 1 year ago, and I still have to pay for some so.
I am already done with it because my research is just kind of very different.
Yeah, me too. Sometimes.
And my bachelor also will pass soon, so might as well just go for it.
Where, what do you do after? So you need to go back to your dream to work. I didn't suspect that.
Till tomorrow. My fiancé will be coming.
Also,
Oh,
maybe.
you'll be up.
I don't know. It's stage training on the moment. News training.
He usually does. He's not this week though.
This is another line.
Oh, hello.
This is a close friend who brought us together.
Thank you for the introduction.
She caused it. Okay, anyway. The same code. We'll just leave it like that. You can ask any questions. All questions are welcome.
All questions.
I'm going to ask you guys. Yours is at 2, right? No. What difference? Oh, no. This is my first, another person in Rajan. He's written in writing. All of us are different. Hello, Neil. Neil, you're met. Met before. How are you? Okay. You ready? 7 minutes more. 7 minutes more. Right, I'll sit back now. If you do that, it might just distract me from the presentation. Yeah, if you're in wrong, I'll get my paper like that. Alright, can you see it? They're going to start coming in hopefully soon. Welcome, sir, for answer.
I think it's they start finding the
Was it difficult to find this from me?
No, the numbers degrees.
No, I came home with my cup, came upstairs to the third floor, down the corridor. Maybe for MIT students. Oh, the arrow that says these are the numbers in this.
No, as in like the entrance itself.
Yeah, the two entrances.
Go to the third floor and
You guys together? Not down?
Yeah. If you yeah.
After this, I will do the 4 directions.
Yeah.
I'm talking like I'm talking.
Yeah, then back to which of the machine?
That, yeah. I'm in the service.
Front wheel is
It's more of an institution actually.
What is my name?
That's
Oh, wow.
there's one in it's the USB charging.
Okay.
The corner
Across from.
Elliot Hotel.
Yeah.
You guys
I didn't need something for school. I thought I'd be actually the
I can see, but I can't read anything. Yeah.
and light is on the right? And nothing is far away. So like being in a bar, watching
Yeah,
sports on
he
TV.
just likes something. And then another piece is something with this.
So I had this inside it. I was looking for it. So
No.
I'm assuming it's
Yeah, I don't think we're going to have this much sense. I mean, oh my God, Tejas.
It's a big family.
Don't do that first, Sorry. Okay, you can take it. He was the
Growing and young, he played tennis.
Have you met Vrinda? She was actually living on the road. Vrinda, yeah.
But more roommates than money.
Kumar. Oh, yeah.
Hey.
I think we were having
Just
no meeting.
The-
I've never meeting, so I need to get my.
Yeah, one my last name is still there.
So he is my
Yeah.
dad's cousin, husband, sister, son.
I want to know it.
Oh.
Before, but I can come.
If you get more than
So he was, I was in Friday and Saturday. You know, save up. So, you know, it's gonna be true. All right, so you think
I'm thinking.
All right. Actually.
Hello.
Oh, that's
Are you working on your
All
defense? Yeah, we do too, but somebody else has to work on it.
Oh, this one? That's the,
That's
that's the curious part.
Cheer, okay. Questions.
Questions.
Okay, so.
I'm working on animations. Things are, resources. Are you even have PowerPoint? Write things on the board.
No, I
You're
use
gonna be
my
like, when I was sitting in Hayden Library, this is the thing that turned me. And somebody sailed by. I had a moment of insight. I'm not making fun of you. I'm just saying, I realized the difference between
Is everything coming?
Sure.
But that's
Yeah.
no slides. Hey, how are you? Good. I just saw him.
We're gonna start soon. We're waiting for the committee members to. It's not gonna start at exactly.
I saw this come right here. Depending on Friday.
Dennis was here. I hope I want that.
Look at that, 1 minute left.
I think we run from there.
You so simple. I went to give a lecture in Austria, a full professor didn't come. We had to wait 15 minutes. Like they said, today they really go 5 minutes for 1 year.
At least 4 or 5 months. Ideally for a year. We'll see when I run out of.
Oh, hi, I was just good. How you doing?
Oh, wow. So I'm sitting in the dark room. I was in green class. And then they fall asleep. That was the thing.
You gave up the pipe before I. You're the chair, right?
You know the cross
I know. Thanks, everybody, for coming. We're pretty much on time. It's a pleasure for me to give this opportunity to Reetik to present his work. We tried to remind him that the presentation is for the committee as well as the audience. He's tried to make things very understandable for everybody. So I'm looking forward to seeing the presentation. I know you are too, so go ahead.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. As many of you know, I think hopefully everyone knows that I'm Reetik and I come from the Civil and Environmental Engineering at MIT, but also the Center for Computational Engineering. And today I'm going to talk about multi-agent real-time decision making in water resource systems. And in this talk, I'm going to look at 2 different water resource systems. The first water resource system is a hydropower. In this picture, it shows that you are storing a water in a reservoir, and an operator who is operating this reservoir has to decide how much water he needs to release at every time step. And based on how much water he releases, he defines how much energy he's going to make. The second system that I'm looking at is the groundwater management problem, which is defined as a common pool problem where multiple players, or in this case, the farmers, are going to fight against each other and decide how much water, and they decide how much crops they grow, how much food they can make. And the decision for them here is they decide how much water to pump from the ground today. So the underlying feature that we see in both of these cases that I'm going to talk about throughout this presentation is the fact that you want to make the best possible decisions time after time. And these decisions change over time because the state of the system changes. So before we get into each of these cases, I try to bring out some of the common things. So the first common thing in both of them is the decision maker. In the hydropower case, the decision maker was the reservoir operator. In the groundwater case, the decision maker was each individual farmer. So what are the factors that affect this decision maker in making decisions? The first factor that we know is the performance criteria. Now, performance criteria can be you are trying to maximize the power generation. For the farmer, the performance criteria is how do I make the most money by growing the most amount of crops. So there are different kinds of performance criteria that we can look at. The second thing, which is essentially going to act as a constraint on the objective function of how the decision maker behaves, is the physical system dynamics. This essentially limits how much the decision maker can extract out of your system. For example, in a reservoir, you are bounded by the volume of the reservoir. You cannot get more than what's available to you. So that's one kind of constraint that's contained in the physical system dynamics. The next factor that affects the decision maker is uncertainty. Now, uncertainty can be in the form of not knowing how this physical system behaves. Uncertainty can also be in the form of the performance criteria that things in the future are going to change. My objective function is going to change. So there are different things that can affect the decision maker. The fourth and the final thing, which is somewhat exciting, is the presence of other decision makers. Along with this decision maker who's using the resource, there can be other decision makers who may behave cooperatively or may behave competitively against the decision maker. Now, this decision maker needs to figure out how these other decision makers are going to behave. So for the groundwater case, if farmers are all cooperative, the farmer needs to think that, okay, everyone is cooperative, so I should behave nice. If everyone else is behaving uncooperatively, then the farmer is going to decide, okay, even I'm going to behave uncooperatively. So with all of these inputs for the decision maker, what does he need to then find out? The first thing he needs to find out is an optimal decision rule. Now, what's a decision rule? A decision rule is essentially tells you, if the state of the system is this today, what's my best course of action? For the reservoir, if the water level in the reservoir is this much, how much water should I release today? For the groundwater case, if the depth of the water table is at this height, how much water should I pump today? So that's the optimal decision rule. Now, when you apply this decision rule, you then need to figure out what your actual performance is. You might have estimated something that you're going to generate, let's say, $100 billion this year, but that might not be the case. That might not be the case. So you need to figure out what you actually generate. The third thing you want to also see is, because there's an inherent uncertainty in your physical dynamics or the performance criteria, you need to make some kind of risk assessment analysis to make sure that you get the best out of your system. So with these, this kind of work's been done in the water resource literature, but there have been two trains of thought. The one is a hydrology-based analysis, and the second is an economics-based analysis. The hydrology-based analysis essentially looking at people who are experts in hydrology. So they use very realistic models that model the crap out of the physical system. They capture the uncertainties, the model parameters, the measurements, and everything. But using all these things makes the problem very computationally expensive. And because it becomes computationally so expensive, they have to then stick to very ad hoc decision rules that are very simple to implement. On the other side, you have the economists, resource economists, who do not like these realistic models because it makes things complicated. So they use very simple models or simple abstractions of the realistic model. And because they use simple models, they do not capture all the model parameters or measurements. This makes their problem very easy to solve. And that's why they can use these really good decision rules that can talk about fancy things based on the simple models. So the goal of my talk today, or my research over the past 5 years, has been, how do you bridge the gap between these two perspectives? My first goal is a response towards the hydrology-based analysis, where you want to develop better decision-making framework for managing a water resource system. My second goal is for the response to the resource economists to develop more realistic models where you can carry out optimization or make decision rules in real time. Okay, so now let's go to our first case study, which is the hydropower operation problem. So this is a single agent optimization problem. When I say single agent, it means that there is only a single person who's going to operate this reservoir. So what's this reservoir? So the reservoir is essentially a large body of water. It gets filled by this river that's present upstream, and the river has uncertainty in it. You don't really know what's going to happen, how much water is coming in from the river. Now, as the reservoir operator, he gets to decide every day or every month or every few certain time interval, he gets to decide how much water should I release from the turbine. Now, once the water is released from the turbine, it generates electricity. This electricity is then sold to a consumer. But in literature, you often see a divide between these two sides. There are people who worry about the electricity generated, but they use simple ad hoc rules of how the reservoir has been operated. And on the other side, we have the people who look at how the reservoir needs to be operated, but they kind of neglect how the electricity is being sold. So in my research, I come up with some kind of a contract between the user and the operator to connect these two people or fields. So how do we do that? So first, what does the reservoir operator do? So he has to optimize a certain objective. In this case, he wants to maximize his revenue, not maximization of total power, not reaching a certain power contract, but he just needs to maximize his net present value in PV. And how does he do that? He does that in two ways. First, he's adjusting the turbine release. That is, he adjusts how much water is being released through the reservoir. The next one is he decides what's the power contract between him as a reservoir operator and the user. But this power contract needs to be decided before the operations begin. These two objectives, while you're trying to maximize this objective, you're constrained by the flow equation, or how the water gets stored in the reservoir and how much water gets out from the reservoir. And in addition to that, you have information of how the water is coming in, what's the time series, or what's the uncertainty in the inflow. Now, this reservoir operator, what does he therefore need to decide? He needs to make two decisions, two broad classes of decisions. One decision is an optimum contract. So before your operations begin, he needs to decide what's the most optimal contract. Now, how does he decide what his optimal contract is? So let's say you have this revenue versus energy curve. Energy on the x-axis, revenue on the y-axis. If you're more than one, if you're more than zero, you generate a profit. If you're less than zero, you generate losses. And the user now says, okay, let's make a contract along this red line. So the higher contract you promise, the more revenue you generate. And the lower contract you promise, the less revenue you generate. Now let's say you fix a contract at this particular value. This is your negotiated contract between the operator and the user. Now, if you generate energy, if the reservoir operator is able to generate the energy same as this energy generated, denoted by this cross, you get the revenue indicated at the intersection of the red and the black. Now, because there is an uncertainty involved in how much is coming into the system, you can sometimes generate more energy. So what do you do with that energy? Now, this user is not going to take that excess energy. He said, I don't want that. You can do whatever you want to. You can do whatever you want with that excess. So the reservoir operator then sends it to a secondary market where the energy is then sold at a much lower price. So that's why you see that there's a difference in the slope of the red dotted and the continuous black line. Now, if there are situations where there is energy generated more than the energy contract, there are also situations where you generate less. So what do you do in those cases? In those cases, the operator then has to buy that deficit energy from somewhere else, again from a secondary energy market, and bring that back to the user. And now when he does that, he's essentially going to pay a penalty because this is an uncertain energy that he might have to buy in real time. So this is the way we have structured our optimum contract. Now let's say once you have decided optimum contract, what's your decision rule? Now a decision rule is something that tells you how much water you should release in real time. Essentially, let's say today on August 1st, 2018, you know that your storage is at 60% of its maximum capacity, and there's a certain amount of water coming in from the river. So based on those two things, you try to find out, okay, if I'm at this particular point on the inflow and this particular point on the storage, this is what I should release. And this is what you call as a decision rule. So now the reservoir operator has to figure out these two things. Let's start with the optimum contract. Okay, sorry, this is a couple of. You therefore need to combine the optimum contract and the real-time decision rule when we talk about this. Okay, we'll see. I'll talk more about the coupling between the two as we go forward. Okay. How do you find an optimum energy contract? So let's say today, August 1st, 2018, I, as a reservoir operator, want to make a contract with a user for the next 8 years. How do I do it? So I know what's the uncertainty involved in the amount of water that's coming into the reservoir. So I then make a bunch of predictions of what can happen in the future. And I then start with, let's say, if I say that my contract energy is at this particular value, let's call it the low contract energy. So for this particular contract energy value, I try to maximize my revenue generated across all these random future scenarios. So this is our energy curve, energy versus time curve, and this is your promised contract. Now, based on this contract, you try to generate a decision rule, which connects if the current water level in my reservoir is at a particular value, how much water should I release? You then apply this decision rule across a bunch of random scenarios that can happen over the next 8 years from August 1st, 2018 until August 1st, 2026. So you then see, then you get these squiggly lines which are essentially what is the actual energy generated. Now you see that in this particular at least picture, all these energy generated are much more than the contract. This means that there's a lost revenue in not fixing the right contract. So, okay, then as a reservoir operator, I say, okay, maybe this is not a good contract. Let's go for another contract. So iteration 1 has this contract energy and a decision rule. I move to another contract value which is slightly higher. So now again, energy versus time, this is your contract value. So now for this contract, you again generate another decision rule. Because if you promise a higher contract, you have to change the way you are making decisions of how much water you want to release. So again, you create another new decision rule, and then again you test it across a bunch of random scenarios over the next 8 years. And then you come up with another set of actual energy generated time series. Now you see here in this particular simulation, in this particular picture, that your generated energy are always lower than the contract. So this means that you're promising too much than what you can offer. So, okay, so this is still not good enough. Again, contract to decision rule D. Now you move on to another contract value. Now you kind of are now in between these two contract values. You promise this energy now, and you again find out a new decision rule. You again test it out. Now you see that your actual generated energy time series is quite close to your contract. So you keep repeating this process of finding a better contract, and you finally reach a point where you have no more improvement in your revenue generated, and that's going to be an optimum contract. Now, I talk here something about the decision rule A, decision rule B, decision rule C. Now, how do you generate this decision rule? To generate these decision rules, you need optimization techniques. So now, in this particular case, we look at 4 different optimization techniques. The first technique is called the perfect information scenario. In this scenario, the reservoir operator has perfect foresight of what's going to happen tomorrow. He knows by some divine power or anything, he knows what's going to happen. So that's the best case scenario. He's going to get the maximum performance out of the reservoir. So this is therefore not really predictive, and it's easy to implement because you know what's going to happen in the future. The next scenario, so the next technique is the stochastic dynamic programming technique. Now this is considered as a gold standard in trying to figure out in real-time decision making. So the way this technique works is, it starts, so as I said, you start making a contract from 2018 until 2026. So the dynamic programming, what it does is, it starts from 2026, goes backwards in time until 2018, and for every possible state of the system and every possible inflow, every possible water level, it tries to find out what's the best action you can make. Therefore, because it carries information of what's going to happen in the future, this is a predictive technique. And because you are looking at every possible scenario of what can happen in the future, this becomes computationally very expensive. So although this is a gold standard, it's difficult to use. The next technique is a model predictive control, which is a slightly suboptimal version, not slightly, the suboptimal version of the stochastic dynamic programming technique. So instead of going to 2026, it says today on August 1st, 2018, I look only for the next, let's say, 6 months. And I predict what can happen over the next 6 months, and I optimize and make decisions based on that. So although this is still a predictive technique, because you always look only at a small horizon, it becomes computationally less expensive to apply. The last technique is the standard operating policy, which is what's currently being used. These are ad hoc rules which have no prediction. The rules are generally derived based on what has happened in the past, and they're pretty easy to implement. Okay, so now how do these techniques act in real time? Let's look at that. So this is a simulation of an 8-year contract period, and I'm looking only at stochastic dynamic programming. The top panel here shows the amount of water that the operator needs to release. The dotted line indicates the inflow measurements that are always one step behind. You do not know what's going to happen in the future, but you still need to make the decision for the next fine step. The middle panel indicates the storage of the reservoir. The bottom panel indicates the energy generated. Now the red line here is referring to the contract. The stochastic dynamic programming in this case chooses a contract of 0.61. All these variables on the y-axis are normalized. So the energy and the storage are always going to lie between 0 and 1. The release is normalized with respect to an average of the river inflow. So it's always going to be around 1. So now let's run this simulation. So The information of what's going to happen in the future is coming in real time to the stochastic dynamic programming technique. Because the dynamic programming technique does not know what's going to happen, it has to make predictions. But you see, we want to pay our attention to this energy curve over here. The red line, as I said, is a contact that's fixed. And the stochastic dynamic programming is able to keep the actual energy generated always above the contact. Now, this is a good sign. It's able to make good predictions, it's able to make good decisions, and therefore you're able to generate more than the contract. But there are also some certain instances, like around 35, at the 35th time step, that you generate less. So this is because you don't really know what's going to happen. There's always a chance that you don't get enough water. So, sorry. Yeah, so that you're not always promised that you will generate more than the contract. So the idea is that based on this the uncertainty in the reservoir inflow, you want to fix the optimum contract. The stochastic dynamic programming, because it's a real-time technique and it wants to maximize the power generated, it always tries to keep the reservoir close to its maximum capacity. You see that it's always trying to keep it 80% above its maximum capacity. Now, this simulation was with stochastic dynamic programming. Now we show the same simulation for all the other three techniques. This picture is a bit too much. A lot of things are happening, but I can tell. So the blue again indicates the dynamic programming. The red lines indicates model predictive control. The yellow line is the standard operating policy that's used, and the purple line is the perfect information scenario. So now let's first focus on the energy generated. The perfect information scenario, as I mentioned, has perfect information of what's going to happen in the future. And if you look at its energy profile, you see a very stable profile. It's because it knows what's going to happen in the future, it is easily able to exploit its result, the turbine releases or the decisions. You see the maximum, it takes down the reservoir to almost 70% of its maximum value, because it knows that in the future it's going to get high inflows. The stochastic dynamic programming, being a better predictive technique, is the other three techniques want to keep the reservoir at much higher capacity all the time. The stochastic dynamic programming, on an average, keeps it well above than the model predictive control and the standard operating policy. So now we see that you tested a given random inflow scenario for all the four techniques. Now let's say you want to test it for 400 different random scenarios, or 500 different random scenarios. You essentially then get a probabilistic performance of how much revenue or energy you generate. So let's look at that. So this graph essentially tells you how much energy or what's your revenue that you would generate. It's a probability way of saying what's the chance or what's the revenue that you would generate. 0 is the minimum and 1 would be the maximum. Now, there are a lot of important things, statistical things that you can get out of this density curve. The first would be your maximum likelihood. So in this case, you are most likely to generate 70% of your maximum revenue. Or you could look at what's your average. In this case, it would be around 65% of the maximum revenue. So these are something a standard technique would say. In addition to these both, you can also look at the tails of this distribution. So here in this case, the red shaded area indicates the probability that you would generate 50% less than your maximum revenue. And the blue shaded region indicates the probability that you would generate 80%. Now, this kind of analysis is important in terms of risk assessments. And now, we try to compare how all the four techniques perform with this kind of analysis. Okay. Again, dynamic programming is the blue, model predictive control red, standard operating policy yellow, and perfect information is the purple. As expected, the perfect information would perform the best, and it's the rightmost on the curve. So, and then you have the blue, that's the dynamic programming, the red is the model predictive control, and yellow is the standard operating policy. Now, the cost of not knowing what's going to happen in the future is essentially denoted by the shaded region. So this is because essentially we don't know what's going to happen. Now, the difference in our predictive techniques is given by this red shaded line. So this shaded area essentially says because you're using a less predictive technique, you're going to generate less energy. The standard operating policy, if you look, okay, the yellow shaded area says that the standard operating policy shows the highest probability that you generate less than 50% of the maximum revenue. So with this, we kind of, the things to learn from our hydropower analysis is first, predictive techniques generate higher revenue than the standard operating rule by almost 10%, which is a lot. Even getting a 1% improvement in hydropower generation in the US would give you billions of dollars. So although this is a theoretical study, but 10% is a good improvement. Predictive operating rules show low risk of low revenues. This was shown using the shaded regions. And the third one is the inflow variability caps the maximum performance even with perfect foresight. Because there is an inherent uncertainty in the system, you cannot always generate the maximum revenue or keep the reservoir at the maximum water level all the time. So there is an upper limit to how much you can get even with perfect information. So with this, we conclude the study of the case of hydropower operations. Then the next case that I talked about was the groundwater depletion problem. So the groundwater depletion is a global issue. Why? Because the farmers are essentially pumping more water out. Why are they doing that? Because there's a growing population and people are demanding more food. And this problem, one can see these problems occurring in the San Joaquin Basin in the western United States or at the Ganges Basin in northern India. In these regions, essentially, multiple farmers are drilling deeper and deeper wells because they want to pump the groundwater to grow their crops. But so what's my research question on the groundwater case? My research question is first to look at groundwater as a common pool resource problem, where you have a common resource that's being shared between multiple individual thinking agents. And because there are these multiple individual agents, there's obviously going to be certain kind of lack of cooperation between them. Not all of them are going to cooperate, they're going to fight with each other no matter what. And because there's this lack of cooperation, there's going to be an inefficient use of water. If they had cooperated, they would have made better revenue and everything, but there's this mentality that someone else is going to steal my water. This leads to this inefficient use of water. But then you want to ask, okay, let's say you all cooperate. How much does that really make any difference, or is it okay to just behave non-cooperatively? And this question can be analyzed using game theory. And at least my study on the groundwater tries to use game theory to address the issue. Okay, so where do we start? So let's start with what people have been doing until now. So when modeling groundwater as a dynamic game, researchers often use the single cell bucket model. It essentially says that you have this bucket of water comes from the top, goes down and fills the bucket, and the players on the ground essentially drill their wells and they pump this water out. Now this specific bucket model has a lot of deficiencies. The first main deficiency that the bucket model has is they assume that the water level or the aquifer head is a spatially average. So it's only a single water level that all the players experience. Second, they assume that very unrealistic boundary conditions to this bucket model. They essentially assume that all the water that's coming from the top stays below them. It does not go out, but that's unrealistic. Third, the steady state in this bucket model, one can easily figure out is that the pump rate is going to be equal to recharge, and there's no other steady state possible. Now, this is not true. We see that people are still pumping more than the recharge rate, so they are getting the water from somewhere else. And because you use the spatially averaged conditions throughout the bucket, you kind of make a lot of assumption of how the water flow is behaving. So my research here tries to improve this bucket model. So we start with our single cell bucket model. We then improve it further. So now instead of having a single bucket, we use a multi-compartment model where you differentiate the regions where water is coming from and going to. So you have, in this case, you have three compartments. The first compartment is the outer aquifer, which is essentially where the recharge comes in from the top. The water then flows into the inner aquifer where the farmers and the croplands are located. The remaining water then flows into the river, which is modeled as a constant head boundary condition. A constant head boundary condition is one where you assume that the water level is always going to stay constant throughout. Yeah. So in this case, you are essentially, again, using the same spatially averaged head in outer aquifer, a spatially averaged head in the entire inner aquifer, and then the water level in the river stays the same. So now again, going back to the same analysis, what does a player, or in this case, each individual farmer, what does he or she maximize? So now the farmer attempts to maximize his own personal revenue. That's a net present value. And how does he do that? He adjusts his pump rate in real time. However, he is still constrained by how the groundwater flows throughout the system. And now this constraint is, however, common to all the players. Although each of the individual players have an objective function, but all of them share the same, again, groundwater flow dynamics. And players' response to each other is modeled using Nash equilibrium theory, which again I'll talk about a bit more in the next slide. Okay, so now I talked about a player who wants to maximize his benefit net revenue function. What's his revenue function looking like? So the farmer has this form of revenue function. It says that if you pump this much amount of water, you would then be able to grow a certain amount of, you would then be able to grow crops on a certain amount of land, and that you then sell those crops to generate a certain revenue. So that's just a strictly concave function so that you ensure that you get a solution. So, and on the other side, you have the cost function, which is dependent both on how much you pump and also on what's the depth of the water table. So the decreasing head essentially tells you that the water table is going lower and lower. So lower the depth of the water table, higher would be your pump cost. So this, and now as a player or as a farmer, you want to maximize the difference between the benefit and the cost function summed over several stages. You are not worried about just growing crops over this 1 year, but you want to grow crops over the next 5-6 years. So it's summed over many stages. Again, still subject to how the groundwater flows. So now, what are your techniques? What things can you use to make this decision? So the first strategy that we can see is the social optimum strategy. This is a strategy that all players are going to behave cooperatively with each other, and they try to maximize the total net present value, not the individual, but they actually sum across all the agents, and they try to maximize that objective function. The next strategy is the open loop Nash equilibrium. In this strategy, let's say again, today on August 1st, 2018, they are thinking of growing crops over the next 3 years. Players commit to uncooperative action over the next 3 years, and each individual player is essentially looking at their own net revenue function, net present value. And once they decide to a particular set, they just say that, okay, year 1, I'm going to pump 10 units, year 2, 6 years, year 3, 4 units. And all the players essentially declare what they're going to pump, and they just stick to it. So that's an open loop Nash equilibrium. The third strategy is the feedback Nash equilibrium, where instead of fixing how much they pump, they decide uncooperatively how much they should pump, depending on what the current state of the system is. So they say that if on year 2 the water level is, let's say, 10 meters below the ground, I'm going to pump this much. If year 2 I had a water level 5 meters below the ground, I would pump this much. So again, they are trying to maximize their total benefit over the period. The fourth and the final strategy that they use, that I'm looking at here over here, is a myopic strategy. In this strategy, they neglect, or they essentially are blind to the fact that there are other players sharing. So they just forget that there are other people using the resource, and they also forget the part that they have to grow crops in the future. So when, let's say that year 1, they only want to maximize year 1 benefit, year 1 net benefit. If they're at year 2, they forget that they have to still grow at year 3, but they just maximize my net my current benefit minus cost. So it's obvious to some extent that the revenue would therefore be worse for the myopic, and it would be the best for the social optimum where everyone is behaving cooperatively. So we now use this analysis. Okay, before that, we now use this analysis on again the groundwater problem that I described. However, when we use realistic groundwater flow dynamics, finding solutions to these strategies can be very difficult. So, but certain problem structures or certain forms of the problem can give very convenient solution structures. So in this case, if your net present value has a quadratic structure, so again, so this is essentially showing your benefit minus cost. And if this has a quadratic structure with respect to your player for your farmer, ice, pump rate, and the state of the system. So if you call this as a quadratic structure and your flow dynamics, or rather how your groundwater system evolves over time, if that can take a linear form, which so this equation essentially connects how your systems, the state of the system is going to evolve in time, and is dependent upon what has happened in the past and what actions the player takes. So if you have these two forms to your objective function and to your dynamics of your groundwater model, you then have a very simple form to how your solution or your pump rate would look like. Your pump rate would essentially say that if your water level or your groundwater water table is at a particular depth, you should pump this much times plus a constant. So this is an affine strategy. So now let's then look at some results of what happens. So we take, this is a representative case based on the San Joaquin Valley. And the players are essentially trying to grow water-intensive cash crops like almonds. And the first panel over here indicates the outermost compartment where you had the recharge coming in from the top. So this essentially compares how the four strategies, if the players were to take these four strategies, the social, the open loop natural equilibrium, the feedback natural equilibrium, and the myopic strategy, how would that evolve over time? So this is a time simulation of over 60 years. Okay, again, this represents essentially the water level or the aquifer head in the outer aquifer. The next figure indicates the water level in the inner aquifer. The last figure on the right here indicates what do the players actually decide, what's the total pump rate from this inner aquifer, because all the farmers are placed in the inner aquifer model. So what are the things that we should see here? First, even for over a 60-year time period, the system does not reach a steady state. So resource economists in general just often look at the steady state and they make their policy decisions based on the steady state. But you see that even after 60 years, you do not reach a steady state. The initial condition over here represents a point where there was no agricultural development and there were no pumps. So this is a common initial condition for all the four strategies. And over time, you try to see how the system has evolved. And over 60 years, we again don't see that any steady state is observed. So next, what do you see? The social strategy, when it comes to the pump rates, the social strategy pumps the least and the myopic strategy pumps the most. Because the myopic is only interested in maximizing the current benefit minus cost, they behave the most aggressive. And because they pump so high, they also therefore have a faster depletion. The third point that we need to see in this slide is the pump rate over here is, so the green line over here indicates the recharge or the amount of water that's coming into the system. And now we see that the players actually are pumping more than the recharge rate. They're essentially using the inheritance they had, like they had an initial water stock, the initial amount of water, and they're just aggressively pumping that. They're not just pumping the recharge. So this is an important analysis to see when it comes to observing the transient behaviors. Okay. So this simulation was with two players who were fighting against each other or behaving cooperatively, but both of them had the same revenue function, right? Both of them were growing almonds. Now let's say one was growing almonds while the other person was growing grapes for making wine, which is more expensive. Or rather, it's fetching you more money. Now, what happens in that case? So again, the left panel figure indicates the water level in the outer and the inner aquifer. On the right side, you see individual players' pump rate. On the top, you see the player growing the low value crop, and on the bottom, you see the farmer growing the high value crop. Now, we see the same things that your pump rate is generally more than the recharge and all that stuff. But now we also see other things. For the low value crop, the pump rate from the non-cooperative strategy, the feedback and the open loop Nash equilibrium, they are behaving closer to the myopic strategy. While the farmer growing the high value crop, the uncooperative strategy actually behaves closer to the social optimum. Now, why is this? Because the player growing the low value crop has a lower marginal value, he tends to behave more myopic. He's more interested in just maximizing his current because he has a lower impact on the system. On the other hand, the high marginal value farmer is more forward-looking because he has such a high impact on the system. He wants to make sure that he's getting revenue over the future. So again, this analysis was performed with the LUM model where we had three compartments: the outer aquifer, the inner aquifer, and the river. But we still have certain assumptions in this model. The first that we still have a spatially averaged head in the outer aquifer, and we have a spatially averaged head in the inner aquifer. And all of them again see the same hydrologic conditions in each of these points. So how do we further improve this? So we can further improve this by looking at a small scale distributed model. So instead of having a spatially averaged model, we now have a distributed model where you see that the intersection or the vertices of these triangles each represents a measurement or the state, or it represents a state of the system. So with this with this additional information of what's happening near the red dots over here indicate the pumping wells. So there's player 1 pumping well and there's a player 2 pumping well. Now, because you have a highly detailed mesh or a groundwater model, you can look at local effects. Now, so here we are drawing what the water level of the hydraulic head looks like when you try to do the water level along the dotted line. So now, player 1, assuming that here player 1 is going to pump more, so he has a higher drawdown than player 2. Now, for a spatially averaged LUM model, they would just essentially see this from this red dotted line. They would see the same water level. But by using a small scale distributed model, you can look at these finer details in your model. So what have we achieved? With a more realistic model, we can now look at local drawdown effects. In addition, we can also look at how pumps behave with respect to how close they are to these boundaries and with respect to each other. So if the pumps are going to be close to each other, maybe players are going to behave differently. If the pumps are far away from each other, players might behave differently. So you can see those effects with this small scale distributed model. And we can still carry the same game analysis of social feedback Nash equilibrium and the myopic analysis even with this, as long as we stick to the linear quadratic structure. So now let's look at some cases again. So the first case looks at two players who have the same revenue function, which means that they're growing the same crops and they have equal access to water. Now, what does this look like? So, yeah. So this is essentially two players, player 1, player 2. They are located at they are both equally located from each of the boundaries, and they're equidistant from everywhere. Now, when you now run the simulation of the different strategies and everything, how does that look like? So this shows a snapshot of the feedback Nash equilibrium strategy. The hotter the color, rather the redder the color, it means that the higher is the water level over there. So in this case, you have the water coming in from the left boundary, and on the right side you have the river. So now you see that because there are these two pumping wells, the drawdown or the local drawdown in these two are much higher than the remaining surrounding areas. Now this is again not captured using the LUM model, spatially averaged LUM model. What else do we see here? We see that not all the water that's coming in from the left boundary goes into the pump. Some of the water that's coming in from the left boundary is actually just directly going into the river. So when economists or any LUM or spatially average analysis says that you are capturing all the recharge, it's not possible because you can only take that much water that you can suck in from your local or regional drawdown. So this was, again, two players with equal revenue functions and equal water access. Next, we again look at two players, again, equal revenue functions, but now they have unequal water access. Now, what does that mean? Now we therefore have one player who is closer to this recharge boundary and one player who is closer to the river. So now, again, they're both doing the same crop. In the spatially average or the LUM model, this would essentially say that the both players would behave the same because they have the same revenue function. But because now with the distributed with this spatially distributed model, we see a different story. The one who is closer to the recharge boundary can only take a small amount of recharge that's coming in, while the one who is closer to the river has access to a much larger area of the recharge boundary and also access to the river on the right. So even though both of these players have the same revenue function, they now actually pump differently because they don't have equal access to water. And that's, again, summarizing that result. And yeah, players who are closer to an easy source of water would obviously tend to pump more. So finally, what do we conclude from our groundwater game analysis? First, the well placement and local water access actually plays an important role in deciding what a player should behave or how much he should pump. Second, obviously, the social optimum or the all cooperative strategy performs the best. Third, although you have cooperation, we see that in all these results, the cooperation is only about 10%, which from an economic point of view, 10% isn't much. You need as high as maybe 30 or 40% for you to actually invest in making some kind of management institution or something for people to better utilize or manage the groundwater. Okay, so with this, I kind of conclude my presentation. So the original contributions in my research are, first, in the hydropower operation problem, we looked at combining contract selection with real-time strategy, and we see that using the contract selection with real-time gives you different contracts for different decision rules. Next, we also show stochastic comparisons between different strategies and define different kinds of risks which are important when it comes to selling electricity to a consumer. On the groundwater game analysis, we looked at using dynamic game solutions to very realistic and high-dimensional groundwater model. Okay, that's been my research. With this, I conclude my presentation, 5-year-long presentation. Okay, acknowledgements. I would first like to thank Professor Dennis McLaughlin, who has stuck with me for 5 years, and we have gone through loops and loops of the same thing. Sometimes we start in January with a new idea, and we come back in October saying maybe that was not the right thing to do. It goes back to what you had done. But yes, he has been very helpful, and you have taught me a lot about making good research and not just polluting the literature. And I would also like to thank other committee members, Professor Saurabh Amin, who has helped me a lot in understanding the game analysis of groundwater and trying to ensure that you ask the right research questions when you're trying to solve a certain problem and not just worry about using fancy mathematical techniques. Professor Ken Stresbeck, he has helped me a lot. I've kind of been inspired by you that having an applied view towards managing water resources using technical knowledge with application in real life. So I think I need to carry that when I kind of continue doing research. Professor Charlie, who has helped me with this presentation, 2 days ago. Was it yesterday? Okay, and also making sure that the groundwater model was actually right to a certain extent. In terms of my research has been sponsored by the MIT Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, the Environmental Solutions Initiative, and the MIT JWAPS of the Journal World Water and Security Lab. The other collaborators that I should thank was the joint project we had about understanding groundwater games with Professor Parag Pathak in economics and Will who is a graduate student in the economics department. In addition, I would like to thank the courses at MIT, Professor Bertsekker's dynamic programming, which was essentially my master's thesis, and also to some extent my PhD, and the game theory course, which kind of set the foundation for me to understand, to some extent, the game theory and how it's used. So, aside from the academic acknowledgements, let's go to the personal one. Okay, there are a lot of people here, a lot of friends, and many of them are, few of them are here. I would first like to thank my lab mates, Tiziana and Anjali, who we have had a lot of conversations over the past 5 years, and it's been great. And thank you for keeping up with me and for answering all my random sarcastic questions all the time. And thank you to Parsons as a whole, our lunch group, Neha, Irene, Michael, for starting all those discussions about totally random things irrelevant to reality or research. And I really enjoyed all the hiking trips that we go almost every September or October. Hopefully we have one this year if someone is willing to volunteer. I would like to thank my close friends, I think Saurabh, Ankit, Jaisha, who are here. They are my roommates for the past 2 years, and things happen in the apartment. A lot of people. So it's the decent men group that we call ourselves. Thank you for what's been happening. And I would also like to thank the other Indian community, both at MIT and outside, who I've had a lot of experiences with. The next, I would like to thank the MIT Water Club, who kind of helped in continuing my research to look at water resources in general. The next is the MIT Rowing Club, which was a 2-year stint that I had with a relationship that I had with them. And we went to a lot of places, did a bunch of things, and it happened. And currently, my continued interest towards the badminton club, and some of them are over here, who have taken off from their work jobs and they're here. Thank you for coming here, and it's been a pleasure to spend the weekends, 8 hours of my weekends with you guys. Finally, I would like to thank my family. That's my dad, mom, my brother, Vikran, and my sister-in-law. And so my brother has been instrumental in pushing my parents, or forcing them to let me come to MIT and just do a PhD for the next 4 years at least. That's what they thought. Finally, I would also like to thank Uma, my fiance, who is here. She just flew here for 1 day from Dallas, not from India. And she has constantly been emotional support for me throughout this experience. With this, to everyone, thank you. And any questions?
Well, thanks so much, Reetik. You all know the procedure. You folks can all ask questions. Softball or
I'm gonna ask you an easy question. So,
well, and then after that, you all go, and then we ask the easy questions. So go ahead,
so
please.
do you consider like seasonal variations? Like I suppose in winter and summer, like farmers don't use the same amount of water.
So in this current analysis, I have assumed that we are looking at a time interval of 1 year all the time. So we're not looking at a monthly time step, but on an average, what does the player do throughout the entire year? So yes, you could look at the monsoon where your water level would increase, the water table would come up, and again, the summer it would go down. So yes, that can be done, but I have not done in this, at least in this presentation. Thank you for the easy question. Yes.
I'm wondering how fast can you ramp up hydropower production and scale it back? Because sometimes on the 15-minute market for electricity, you can get more profit than the long-term contracts. And so I was wondering how you can take that into account.
That's true. Okay, that's a good question. So the way this has been modeled is we look at monthly time steps. So you're not looking at a small ramp-up markets, but rather over the next month, how much water do you do? So, but yeah, you could do that. So that would be a small short-term analysis. And those analyses are generally centered around trying to manage storms rather than power management, because here you would essentially make a contract between the hydropower and maybe someone who always requires a lot of energy, like an aluminum smelting industry, and you cannot just change how much power you generate over every 50 minutes or something. So you kind of want to maintain a good amount of power generation. So yeah, you could apply the technique to different time scales. Yes.
Can the actual infrastructure
Oh,
handle
can the actual infrastructure handle?
these wide swings in electricity
I would
consumption?
say, yeah, to some extent, no. So that's an additional term I would have to add in the objective function, which essentially says that you cannot, between two time steps, you cannot change a huge amount of value. So that would essentially be a penalty in your objective. Changing immediately would be a penalty. So, yeah. But then that would involve more planning on the operator's side. Yes, I think.
But do hydropower operators do this?
So I've talked to certain people in, I won't say Tennessee, or water authority people, and so currently they still use the standard operating rule where they use this linear decision rules, and they're okay with it. They keep improving this linear decision rule based on information that they're getting in, and they do not place in the prediction as part of their decision rule. So yes, there is certain potential. But yeah, you're right that this system looks very simple. The system that I'm looking at is essentially a primary purpose is to generate hydropower. So it is kind of unrealistic. You still have water demand of people wanting to use the water downstream. So there are a lot of other objectives, but we wanted to keep the objective simple because we wanted to analyze the difference of strategies. When you have multiple objectives, you then have a lot of conflicting things coming in, and it's difficult to differentiate what's causing what. Does that answer your question?
That does. So now I'm wondering, like, so it seems like you kind of roughly know how to, like, are they going to apply this at some point by like doing?
They should. The 10% seems a lot, but maybe when you involve all the infrastructure and all these other changes, like Mark mentioned, you cannot change service or release so fast over time. So maybe the 10% comes down to even, let's say, 0.5%, but still that 0.5% is millions and millions of dollars.
So what are they hiring, like?
Because something that's so often you see that they are very conservative towards changes. So if something is working, why change it? Any other questions? Any question would work. Yes.
About your predicted model, can you actually go to that slide so I can kind of speak to it? My question is pretty much going to be